So, hello and welcome. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to welcome once more Hugo Vickers. And today, Hugo and I are going to, Hugo is going to talk about Cecil Beaton. We have at Blenheim Palace at the moment two exhibitions, one about Cecil Beaton and his photography, and another about Cecil Beaton and the theatre. So we're going to talk about that, but there's so much more to Cecil Beaton. And Hugo, I'd like you to start, if you would, by telling me or telling us how you became involved with Cecil Beaton.
Well, I was very lucky because to some extent I had been brought up looking at the royal family photographs, and in the very room in which I'm sitting now, my parents had a gramophone which used to produce The Night They Invented Champagne and other songs from Gigi. And so Gigi and My Fair Lady I was familiar with. And so in a way he was, and I'd been taken by my mother to see the tail end of the 1958 production of My Fair Lady, and I saw it in about 1964. So there was no Rex Harrison, no Julie Andrews, but Zena Dare was still in it. So there was a lot of background information, which was good. But what actually happened was, the nicest possible way, is that my book on Gladys, Duchess of Marlborough, came out, the first version of it, in September 1979, and he had it read to him. He'd had a stroke by that stage, and he was looking for a biographer, and so he asked me to come and see him. And I went down in December 1979, and we talked about other things. In fact, there was a move that I would write about Princess Marina at the time, so we talked about that. And nevertheless, I knew and he knew the real reason why I was there. And then I got chosen, and then Christmas intervened. And so I got in touch after Christmas, and his secretary, Eileen Hose, said, well, it's his birthday on the 14th of January. Come anytime you like after that. So I said, well, why don't I come on the 15th of January? So she said, splendid. So I came down to lunch and had a nice talk with him, and went across to the studio and saw the full capacity of all the things I was going to be working with, the diaries and all the lots of folders of designs and things like this. And he signed a few books for me, and I got into the car and went back to London and gradually wrote him a thank you letter. And it was waiting to be posted when, on the Friday, which is the 18th of January, my mother rang me up and said, it's just on the news that he died. And so I met him those two times. And the only good thing about that is that his secretary, Eileen Hose, knew that he wanted me to do the book. And so she was prepared to help me, I think, in a way that she wouldn't have perhaps helped somebody else who'd just been, sent down to her later on. She might always have been wondering whether Cecil himself would have wanted this. And I mean, I remember she said, that she felt that a lot of fun for both of us had been, taken away, snatched away. But nevertheless, I then worked in the house until it was sold, which was in end of June 1980, and then continued my work until the first book came out in the summer of 1985. It took a long time to do, but off I went on my adventure.
So Hugo, really, if you hadn't said, right, I'll come down the day after his birthday, and had said, I'll come down next week instead, it may not have happened, or may not have happened how it did.
I had been chosen by that stage, so it was official. Right. But I mean, to go back to the original conversation, sort of, do you want to come down before Christmas, or shall we leave it until after Christmas? I mean, if I'd done that, then that might never have. Yeah. So, I mean, it's such a small window of time that the other book came out in September, and and he read it by December. I mean, it's very, very short period of time. So I was very, very lucky. And also, the lovely thing about it was that, if somebody has read a book that you've written and asks you to become their biographer, it's not sort of like telling you to change your technique completely. I mean, I think one of the reasons why he chose me was, well, there were two reasons. One, that he had met Gladys, but he didn't really see her point. He'd missed her. And so she retained a sort of mystery and glamour for him, which, perhaps I'd been able to explain a little bit in my book. And secondly, of course, because she was so very old, and I had to write every question down on a piece of paper, but then she would answer them if she wanted to. He, having had a very bad stroke, knew that I think that I would be patient with him, which indeed I was, because, for example, he would say things like, it was a town in Italy, and you'd say Venice, no, Florence, Rome, Rome. Then he'd get it, So that was, but which is what we biographers do. That's perfectly well understood. I mean, so I would have been very happy to do that, and not to have minded at all if he took a little time to the essence of the story.
I think what's rather extraordinary, Hugo, is that, by the time he died, was he 76? Is that right?
Yeah, 76 and 4 days, as it were.
Yeah. And you were in your late 20s.
Yes.
And I think that's quite extraordinary that such a young man, he clearly thought a lot of you, to ask you to take that on.
Well, I mean, I'll be absolutely honest with you. I mean, I remember thinking when I got the commission, I thought, goodness, maybe I'm not going to be a failure in life, because all young people fear that and feel that. And to get the first book published was an enormous battle. I had to go through different agents, and publishers rejected it, and they tried to trick me, and all sorts of things happened. They tried to make me write a book about Consuelo and Gladys. I didn't want to do that. And eventually, luckily, that worked. But it wasn't easy. So after that, to get this extraordinary commission was wonderful. But what was really good about Cecil Beaton was, there are some people in life who sort of close the door behind them as they go through life. And there are other people who send down a ladder for the next person. In French lifts, there is sometimes a sign, or used to be in the olden days, which said, "Il faut renvoyer l'ascenseur." When you get to the top floor, you press a button, then you send the lift down to the next person. And that is what Cecil Beaton did in life. He was incredibly generous to a whole string of people. I could think of people like Truman Capote, even people like Luther Freud and Francis Bacon, come the Rolling Stones, and all sorts of people that he photographed. Now, it may not have been absolutely essential for them to be photographed by Cecil Beaton, but in a sense, it was like, if life is a game of snakes and ladders, you definitely went up a rung on the ladder. You didn't go down a snake. And so so for him to sort of select me was just, I felt part of, a sort of long tradition that he had, or that's what I discovered as I went along.
Well, I think that brings us quite nicely on to, can we talk again? Can you talk a little bit about his early life, because he kind of created this persona, didn't he? From what I've read and what I've seen. Can you give us a little bit of background?
Yes, I mean, Truman Capote described him as a total self-creation, and I think that's what was so interesting about him. His father was a timber merchant in the days when they made roads out of timber blocks. So his father at one time made quite a good living, but as time went on, they stopped doing that, and his business collapsed. And by by the 1930s, when he died, he was pretty much a broken character without much going for him. And what was so extraordinary was Cecil Beaton had his mother and his aunt Jessie, who we'll meet her presently. She had been married to a Bolivian diplomat, and he thought that she was the height of chic, because occasionally she sort of put powder all over her face and wore exotic clothes and went to some rather minor court function. But she, in a way, was one of Cecil Beaton's ways out. And those two sisters were the daughter of a blacksmith in Temple Sowerby. I mean, and so he discovered this later on, and he wasn't terribly pleased. So he came from this middle class, stultifying background, and he had to escape into a more romantic world. Now, this picture, these two pictures, I think actually show it rather well, because he was very fond of Aunt Jessie. But if you look at her, they're both taken in his garden at Broadchalk, Reddish House. Aunt Jessie's figure has disappeared a long time ago. The waist has expanded considerably. So fond as he was of his aunt, she wasn't exactly what he had as an image of what his aunt should be. In fact, I think what he really wanted was Kathleen Nesbitt on the right, the lovely porcelain-featured actress who had been the great love of Rupert Brooke and things. And in a sense, what he did was eventually he got Kathleen Nesbitt into his garden. And what the lovely thing about it was, I mean, I met Kathleen Nesbitt in New York when she was playing Mrs. Higgins, and she was so excited to be there staying with him. He had by that stage become this great figure. And so I do think that's a very important thing. So in a sense, that it's the reality well, the two realities, the one reality of what he was born with, and he transforms that into what he really wanted. So he wanted the other world, and he got it by sheer
He
determination.
did. He did, and he really was self-made, wasn't he? In many respects.
He was, and when he was at Cambridge, he used publicity a lot, which was very unfashionable at those days. And the gentleman appeared in the newspapers when he was born, when he married, and when he died, and at no other time whatsoever. But Cecil Beaton used to send out photographs, and he did a lot of designing for all those productions that they put on. And he would send a photograph of himself to the newspaper editor, saying, "This is Cecil Beaton. He's one of our leading undergraduates. He's currently painting the scenery for Pirandello's Henry IV or whatever it was." And he would sign it Carlos Crivelli or something, and he would deny that he'd had anything to do with it. But of course, they occasionally printed these pictures. And he said, "Well, the whole thing is if you get publicity, you can spend more money, more people will come to the show, spend more money." And it was always sets and costumes by Cecil Beaton, the play written by the author and starring the actors in that order. And when you look at what he sometimes achieved later on, he had a point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, if you think that people nowadays have hordes of PR, they have a whole team, don't they, of publicists and PR and whatever. And he really did take that all into his own hands and ran with it. And I mean, what do you think? What was it? The shortage of money in his family that drove him, or did he know he was special? And what was it?
Well, at the very beginning, you mentioned the fact that at Blenheim you've got two exhibitions, one of basically photography and the other one basically theatre. And actually what you have to remember is that theatre was terribly important to Cecil Beaton all the way through his life. And when he saw a picture of Lily Elsie on his mother's bed, it in a way encapsulated his love of glamorous women, actresses, and of photography. So he started taking pictures of his sisters. They were his long-suffering models. And then gradually it became more sophisticated, and he did all his work with a Vox Brownie camera because he had the most fantastic eye. I mean, again, I keep quoting Truman Capote. He said, "The camera will never be invented, which encompasses all that he actually sees." And that was an extraordinary thing about him. And so photography was a gift that came very naturally to him. And of course, he'd be the first to tell you, it's not the camera, it's the eye that counts. And I give you many examples of people with very sophisticated cameras who take lousy photographs, but he was extremely good. And also he had a kind of rather interesting, a rather cruel eye, so that when he saw a photograph of somebody like, when somebody like Audrey Hepburn was going to come to be photographed, he wouldn't think, sort of, goodness me, this is so exciting, Audrey Hepburn. Well, he might, but equally, he would think neck too thin, chin too pointed, nose too long. And then he would pose her in a way as to avoid her so-called faults and turn her into a beautiful woman, something which in fact she herself completely recognized and said.
Hugo, is this a good time to just have a look at some of his trickery, as it were? So what he did to actually enhance things, as it were.
Yes, well, he's a great one for retouching photographs. So this is a spoof example. So you start with this lady, this rather large lady, who in fact was, I don't know if I'm allowed to use the word char lady these days, but it meant basically she was working in the house and serving the tea. And so the next thing he did, next image, he marks her up. So let's have a look at the second one. So you see, so thin the eyebrows and put in a few bits of hair and a necklace, show daylight between the figure and the pedestal, white bits and so on, fake an earring. And then we end up with number 3, which you must it is quite exceptional. You might even like to show all 3 together. It's quite fun. And obviously that was a spoof, but it does show you what he's capable of in the days before digital enhancing, because later on, people like Lord Lichfield, I remember Patrick Lichfield said that with a digital camera, he would take a picture of Joan Collins and hand it to his assistant, say, take her down 3 points or something. And she would suddenly, become sort of much younger in the screen, But Cecil Beaton did it all with, with the sort of the photographic equivalent of Tipex, if you remember the grim and dreadful days of Tipex, when we all used it when we had to change our typing.
But I love the way he marked it up as well, Hugo. So it's almost, just not that I would know, but it's almost like a plastic surgeon, a cosmetic surgeon kind of saying, take out this, do this, raise this, do this.
Absolutely.
And it's, it's very clever.
And it's very funny as well, of course. I mean, he did have a good sense of humor. And of course, when I sometimes give a lecture about him, I say, you wouldn't expect me to be so ungentlemanly as to point out some other figures in the lecture to whom this process might have been applied. But some of his photographs, if you look carefully, you can realize that people do not have waists like that, frankly.
No, no. Oh, how wonderful. So just to go back, you mentioned that he was at Cambridge, and I believe it was less than successful in conventional terms, his time at Cambridge.
Yes, he did no academic work whatsoever, and he ran up a lot of debts, like a lot of people did, and he came down without a degree. But he did have a great hit in the theatrical world, but just at the very end, he had himself dressed up. I think you've got that image, haven't you, of him? It's about the third one in, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we have. Hold on, let me have a quick. Oh yes, we have. Just a moment.
At the time,
bear with.
Meant to be studying for his exams, he went and had himself photographed by Dorothy Wilding, and this photograph was put up outside the footlights in Cambridge, and he made a big hit there. It's quite a funny. I mean, that's Cecil Beaton. That's Cecil Beaton as an undergraduate,
He was very beautiful, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was good looking, very good looking, and it was an era when they were all dressing up the whole time, and there was all the fancy dress balls and sort of midnight matinees and things. And when he got to know Stephen Tennant, who was very important to him, who was a sort of patron of his, he dressed up all. I think you've also got the picture of them all on the bridge. This group of bright young things.
I have.
And
I have indeed.
That's to show. So what Stephen Tennant would do would be to put out all the clothes on their beds, and then he would pose them. So he became became a sort of like a court jester to this group of people who were all, automatically rich, automatically well connected, which he wasn't, and he sort of ended up. So yes, this picture. He's got people like Rex Whistler and Stephen Tennant and the Youngman sisters and Georgia Sitwell and Cecil Beaton himself. The second one in with the staff. That's him there.
Yeah.
What fun they had,
Did he resent his lack of wealth or his family's lack of wealth when he was surrounded by?
Yes, he did. Yes. I mean, he couldn't do much with his father, and actually, I mean, later on, I think he felt rather guilty about his father because he sort of thought of his father as an old codger sitting in the chair, possibly even smoking a pipe or something like that. He did his best with dressing up the mother, and certainly dressed up the two sisters. I mean, that's why he was so good at My Fair Lady later on, because he dressed them identically and sent them off to balls and things, hoping to get them amazing husbands. And I mean, and putting them into the Book of Beauty alongside all the debutantes and things. He really promoted those two sisters like mad.
Wow. And he had a brother as well?
Yes, it's rather sad. I think there could be quite an interesting study to be done one day. Perhaps it would just be an article about the siblings of very famous people who sort of felt depressed and think, well, we don't quite know what happened with Reggie, but he wanted to go into the RAF, and in fact, I'm very close to RAF Upavon here. He was stationed at RAF Upavon at one point, and people liked him very much. He was a nice, not at all like Cecil, he's much more straightforward, ordinary person. And whether there was a love affair that went wrong, or whether it was his eyesight that meant that he couldn't have a career in the RAF, or whether he just felt eclipsed by Cecil, but he went under a train on an underground station, and I think there's very little doubt that he put himself there. It's never been proven, but that's the general view, and it fits. And that was awful, really awful thing to happen. I think probably you might find some other examples where a sibling has not sort of prospered.
Well, the Winston Churchill springs to mind, with Blenheim, and looking at his children, and One
Yeah,
of them,
well,
was addicted to drink. One of them took her own life, etc.
yes,
So, as you say, I think an
yes,
interesting study to be made.
living up to
Yeah.
the person, and that's why, not really wishing to digress, but when you see the Times obituaries, which I rather dislike, but the Times obituaries nowadays always put in what the children do, and they never seem to be doing anything as impressive as the parent. Sort of says, Fiona works in IT, John has just come out of rehab or something. I mean,
Oh gosh.
obviously
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a bit,
Okay.
but that sort of thing.
We digress, Hugo. Let's go back to Cecil in happier times.
Yeah.
So he then, am I right in saying that he realized that photography might be a way for him to earn some money? He was very original, very talented. So when did his big break come as far as photography goes?
Well, I suppose there were probably several big breaks, but one of them I think really was meeting Stephen Tennant quite early on, and sort of therefore having access to all those bright young things and those girls queuing up to be photographed. And then he was very good with gimmicks as well. He'd climb up on a ladder and make them lie on the floor on some cellophane head to head or something like the Youngman sisters, or he would do images and things like that. And so these all got into magazines like The Tatler, and finally he got himself what looked like a very good contract with Condé Nast. And Condé Nast has always been notoriously difficult to work for, and he found it quite difficult. But he went to America, and then he conquered the New York scene, and he went off down to California with Anita Luce, wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and I remember I met her too. She said, I said, you helped him a lot. He said, oh, he didn't need much help, but he did, of course, need a little push. And then, of course, he was photographing all the stars out in Hollywood and things. And I think that his sort of gimmick, if you like, of climbing up on a ladder and photographing somebody like a beautiful girl on the floor, you can imagine in New York, well, has he been round yet? Has he climbed up on his ladder in your house? Oh, well, you're missing out. And so, they were queuing up to be photographed, you can imagine. And also, let's face it, he placed these girls in this most beautiful Arcadian settings, made them look really wonderful. I mean, who wouldn't want to be photographed by Cecil Beaton?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then again, I was rather fascinated. I listened to Desert Island Discs the other day and listened to the interview with Cecil Beaton, which was broadcast posthumously. But it was fascinating, and he spoke about Edward and Mrs. Simpson and said how he adored Mrs. Simpson, which surprised me. But that must have also been a very important part of his photographic career, presumably.
Yes, of course, not quite as important as he hoped it would be, because he was hoping to, he knew Mrs. Simpson and he had sketched her, and he had, well, you've borrowed a sketch of her that he did in the exhibition.
Yes.
From me, which was done in November 1936. And so he then went out when she was at the Chateau de Condé and took a lot of pictures for her for Vogue. And then he was asked to come for the wedding, but actually not the actual day of the wedding. This photograph was taken the day before the wedding, when they dressed up in clothes. And he had access to photographs. He had a suitcase packed, hoping that they'd ask him to stay over for the event, but they didn't. And then he had a wonderful treasure trove of pictures of them, which he was thinking that he had the biggest scoop of all time. But what he didn't realize, or hadn't really taken notice of, was that there was a funny little man in a raincoat who was from something like the Press Association, who was snapping away. And when he got back to, had to travel back to England by boat, and train and things, saw the Evening Standard, and the other little man's photographs were all over the front page. So he had the best pictures, and the other ones have long been forgotten. Nevertheless, it wasn't quite the scoop he was hoping for. But he did like the Duchess of Windsor very much, and he talked to her a great deal. And in fact, when he went to the Duke of Windsor's funeral in 1972, he actually said, that there was no malice in her at all. She was the best friend you could possibly have. He just didn't feel that really she should have been around the crown. That was the thing. I mean, I think he might have said the same thing about various other people subsequently, don't you think?
I think that photograph's really interesting as well, because if you look at the Duke of Windsor, he looks absolutely delighted and very thrilled. And I think Wallis looks a little bit apprehensive.
Well, rightly so. I mean, I think she was extremely apprehensive, and she talked to Cecil Beaton when he was photographing her at Condé a month or so before, and saying, that she, really thought of stringing herself up on the nearest lamppost, and was, she was trapped. I mean, this is my conclusion on the application, is that fundamentally he didn't want to be king, and so even if he didn't do it consciously, he found somebody who would not be suitable as queen, and in a way, he trapped her, or possibly there might have been an element that he was so determined to have her at any cost that he was prepared to give up his throne to get her. But after that, she had to look after him for the rest of their lives together, and he sort of followed her around, and also he put her into a terrible situation because he turned her into the world's most hated woman, in a sense. The woman who stole the king, which actually she didn't at all. I think now that other things have happened more recently, the Duchess of Windsor has become rather a star. I think there ought to be a public apology to the Duchess of Windsor, such as that people go around doing these days.
Yes, yeah, very true. But again, just to the trouble is, Hugo, I could sit and talk to you all afternoon about anything and everything, but I'm going to just go back to to Cecil Beaton, and also I was really surprised to see that he photographed not only Edward and Mrs. Simpson, but also Queen Elizabeth.
Yes, in his social mobility, he was always in the right place at the right time. She had been photographed rather badly by Hay Wrightson. I think you've got that image as well, a sort of profile one. That, of course, is this picture. And I think it's fair to say that as Duchess of York, she didn't wish to compete with Queen Mary or indeed Queen Alexandra, who were both around when she married in 1923. But then, in 1939, he was summoned to photograph her, largely because actually he was a great friend of the Duke and Duchess of Kent, and Princess Marina sent him to photograph Princess Olga, and Princess Olga showed her photographs to the Queen Mother, and out came that versions of the White Wardrobe from 1938, and I think you've got the image of her in the drawing room, looking amazing.
Yeah, and yes, and looking very girlish, and the lighting was always very important to him, I think, wasn't it, as well?
The lighting and the setting, he had this, he was very aware that because of the theatrical side, that you placed people in their surroundings. So here's the Queen Mother I think she's in the white drawing room, I think they call it. Wonderful picture. And of course, Norman Hartnell, who'd been at Cambridge with Cecil Beaton, had created the wardrobe. Between the two of them, they crystallized her image because, as you know, she went on dressed like that, really, in the evenings for the rest of her life. And these are important photographs because the war came very soon afterwards. So they had to decide whether to release them or not. And they did release them, thinking, this is an image of peace for which we are all fighting, our lovely Queen, compared to what was going on in Nazi Germany with people stomping around in black boots. I mean, this was a very, very significant image.
You mentioned Norman Hartnell. Were Norman Hartnell and Cecil Beaton good friends?
They'd had lunch together occasionally. They were not good friends, no. They hated each other at Cambridge. Well, Cecil Beaton was more of a hater than Norman Hartnell. But I mean, I can't remember who told me this, but apparently the Queen was going to be photographed by Cecil Beaton. And Cecil Beaton was a tiny bit late. And they said, whoever it was said, he's on his way, but he was having lunch with Norman Hartnell, to which the Queen said, well, I'd like to have been a fly on the wall during that conversation. But anyway, it was a good collaboration. And of course, it continued later on because Norman Hartnell did all the dresses of the maids of honor, for the coronation of the Queen, and the Queen's coronation dress, let's face it.
Of course, yes. Hugo, you mentioned the war. We'll come back to the coronation if we may. And again, some of the most stunning, the most striking photographs for which Cecil Beaton is known are a couple in particular of wartime ones. Can you tell me how did he get involved in all that?
I think it's fair to say that by 1939, he was getting a bit bored of photographing beautiful girls gazing through boughs of flowers. And so the war gave him this opportunity to make kind of beautiful and striking and memorable images of the horrors of wartime. And I mean, well, this picture is extraordinary, for example, because it's a very beautiful picture, but my goodness, it's the Blitz, you know, London is burning. I mean, he went round London early in the morning, every day after there'd been a big raid, taking pictures like this of all the Wren churches that were destroyed and so forth. And of course, it's partly through the Queen Mother, actually, that she put him in touch with Kenneth Clarke, who was around the Ministry of Information. And he had this roving commission to take these pictures, and he did put them into books and magazines, and he traveled to the Near East and the Far East, and sometimes in grueling conditions. And this picture, I'm so glad you found that one, of the bombed out child, was terribly significant, and it was put onto the front cover of Life magazine. And in a sense, it was a way of telling the Americans what was happening in Britain. So I'm not going to try and pretend Cecil Beaton was responsible for the Lend-Lease policy immediately, but it didn't do any harm, I can tell you. It was very important because now we have CNN and things, and news has flashed around. But you know, people didn't know what was going on. It took weeks for these images to appear in magazines. But that's a really important one. And fun enough, they've never been able to find that child. She was described as being called Eileen Dunn. Whether that was her real name, I don't know. But nobody's ever found her. She never came forward and said, "I was that girl." You know, and she didn't turn to me. I think she looks a little bit like.
I wonder if she survived. I mean, you know, it's a very good question.
That's another possibility. But I mean, if she was really called Eileen Dunn, I mean, I've tried, you know, dabbling in the ancestry site, and I haven't found her.
Yeah. Wow. Gosh. Okay. So we mentioned the coronation, and again, I'm going to put my Blenheim hat on again for a moment. And of course, one of the Blenheim one of the Spencer Churchill family, Lady Rosemary Spencer Churchill, as she was then, was one of the maids of honour at the coronation. So her parents were photographed by Cecil Beaton, I believe, before the coronation, and then of course Lady Rosemary will have been during the whole, you know, the day, etc. So again, how was it that, why did Cecil Beaton stand out so far ahead of any other photographer at the time? You know, what was so special about him?
Well, I think that he just is he's a brilliant photographer, and he's brilliant at capturing and glamorizing and making stylish images. Of course, he got the photographic commission for the coronation thanks to the Queen Mother. There was some danger that Barrett, who was a friend of Prince Philip's, might have been given that commission, but the Queen Mother swung it for him. And you see, if you look at these two images, on the left-hand side, he becomes really the photographic version of the court portrait painter. I mean, the other portrait by James Gunn, which hangs in all too many embassies around the world, it's okay, but it's nothing like the one of the photograph, in my view. And you know, he had a very, very busy day, and he only had about 5 or 10 minutes, if that, to get that image, and he couldn't check whether he'd got it. You know, it must have been incredibly tense occasion, but wonderful. And yes, I mean, fun enough, Cecil Beaton, when he was at Oxford in 1922, he went to dinner with a friend called Peggy Broadbent, whose mother was Lady Viscountess Dillon. And the ninth Duke of Marlborough came to dinner, and Cecil Beaton was very distressed because he had 3 pearl studs, magnificent ones, in his shirt, where Cecil Beaton only had 1. So that's the earliest connection with the Marlborough family. And then, of course, yes, he photographed the maids of honour. And there they are. And, you know, it's interesting the way he poses. I mean, honestly, they could be taking part in Swan Lake or something, couldn't they? I mean, I'm not sure that those pillars are as high as that. I could be wrong. I mean, anyway, it's a fantastic picture.
It is, and I've only just really appreciated this little reflection, the mirror at the back, which just reflects some of the ladies. Yeah, it is stunning, absolutely stunning. Of course, they're not in their maid of honour dresses in this, they're in evening dresses, but then
there they are. Yes, exactly.
There they are.
Yes.
And there's Lady Rosemary. I feel I need to point her out.
Absolutely.
There we are.
Until
on
very
the right.
recently, all 6 of them were still alive. Unfortunately, Moira Hamilton died within the last year or so, so there's only
Yeah,
5 now.
yeah.
But they are we're all terribly proud. Now, wait a minute, I to tell you this, that Anne Glenconner tells me that Lady Rosemary's dress has been found. Is that true?
Yes, yeah,
It's
it's I mean, it's unbelievable.
yes,
It turned up, and it's absolutely beautiful.
yes.
It needs some conservation work, but the embroidery is still beautifully intact, and I mean, it's stunning, absolutely
I hope
stunning.
we'll be exhibiting it at some point in the palace.
I'm sure we will. I'm
Yes.
sure, and I have to say, I'm so thrilled that it has been found.
Yes.
You know, it was the nicest thing to be able to, you know, to be with her when she saw it again for the first time in goodness knows how many years.
But the 11th Duke, of course, went to his grave with the guilty conscience that he'd managed to lose it. He didn't
Absolutely.
solve from that. Anyway, we must move on.
we must move on. Right. Okay. So Hugo, if you're happy to, we've touched on the photography. I know there's a lot more to say. Tell me a little bit about his absolutely amazing costume design.
Oh, well, I mean, again, you see, I think that was the most exciting thing, the working for the ballet, the opera, the theatre, and later on, of course, films. His costumes for Gigi were absolutely beautiful. And in a way, I always had the theory that because he was so steeped in the Black Ascot of 1910, Ascot took place after Edward VII died and everybody was in black. And that kind of got into his head. But to work on the Belle Epoque and produce those costumes was absolutely ideal for him. It actually, the dress that Leslie Caron wears when she goes to dinner with Gaston in Maxime's is almost a sort of precursor in a way to what he does for My Fair Lady, although I guess he'd probably already done the stage ones. But the great ability that Cecil Beaton had was, as Alan J. Lerner put it, to design costumes which were elegant and funny at the same time, because those black and white Ascot dresses are terribly funny as well as being elegant. And look at the way they stand and the way they pose. We call them magpies against the backdrop. You know, it's quite extraordinary. And he was, I did an interview very recently with Leslie Caron. She's about to be 90. And she said that he was always there in the, when they were getting, all these girls were getting dressed. These obviously, this is My Fair Lady, but for Gigi, because he would come in and he'd be scrubbing the makeup off them because he didn't want them to be coated in makeup. And also pulling the hats back because of course, over their, right down over their faces, because of course they all wanted the hats perched on the back of their heads so that they could be seen in the film and talent spotted, and he wasn't having that for a minute. So he was quite a hard taskmaster. And sometimes these poor ladies, literally once they were put into their dresses, they couldn't sit down, but he couldn't care less about that. As long as it looked good, it was fine. And I think on the stage, when the biggest moment in Cecil Beaton's life was when the lights went up on that black and white, on this scene, on the stage, and the audience literally gasped, and everything he'd been doing all his life was really leading up to that moment. You know, the elegance, the style, the exaggeration, the humor. Fantastic, fantastic moment. Doesn't work quite so well in the film, but it's still pretty good.
Yeah. Hugo, can I just confirm, did he design all the hats as well as the costumes?
Oh yes, very much so.
Wow.
He used to sometimes go to museums and look at examples of things, and sometimes also he looked through old magazines and you know, which from the perhaps from 1910, and then that gave him an idea as to what he should do. And of course, he made them bigger and better. I mean, I remember Alan J. Lerner saying, of course, the famous Ascot Gavotte scene in the film, when sort of you know, somebody passes underneath somebody else with a champagne glass and things like that. All these sort of gestures and sort of movements and scenes and vignettes, etc., were all sort of just thought up with a group of them laughing their heads off beside the swimming pool of the Bel Air Hotel. And, you know, they all had an idea. You know, one of them would, and it was terribly funny. I remember from childhood onwards, the scene where there are two ladies dressed identically and they're looking at each other through their lorgnettes, not at all pleased to see them. It's exactly what could happen in real life.
I I've seen a picture of that. That's what it's just fabulous.
Well worth rewatching that scene.
Yeah,
Great.
definitely. But there was, again, am I right in saying there was a little bit of him that wished that he'd taken to the stage himself?
Yes, well, he did at one point in Lady Windermere's Fan in California, but yes, I think he, well, and of course, when he was at Cambridge, he did act. And of course, what he really wanted to do was to write a play. I mean, that's what he was really, he went on and on with the Gainsborough Girls. And I have seen the production of it. It was about 2 years ago. They did it in a North London theatre. And it's quite a good play. It's perfectly enjoyable, but it just didn't work. I mean, people, I think, took the line that he knew how to create the sets, he knew how to dress the actors and actresses, but he didn't know what to do with them when he got them on the stage. Noel Coward was so good at creating conflict, and bickering between the characters. And Cecil Beaton just didn't have, funny enough, he didn't have that side of him. He just couldn't pull it off. And goodness me, he tried.
But to be fair, he did pull so many other things.
Exactly.
When you think about how he started out, and he was, he kept sending the photographs, and he used to sell stories to the gossip columns, didn't he?
Yes,
of the news.
And putting in announcements about parties, and yes, I mean, it was all quite well crafted, and he knew what he was doing when he did those things, and it was all to an end, though, and I think it's perfectly understood now. I remember Diana Vreeland, who was a great friend of Cecil Beaton, she said once, she was perfectly happy to do an interview and come out with all those remarks like, pink is the navy blue of India and all that stuff, so long as they mentioned the museum, the Metropolitan Museum where she was working. That was the whole point of the article. He knew all about that instinctively. So he was very good.
Did he achieved great success without any doubt at all? Did he actually manage to savor it? What was the pinnacle of his achievement? Was it his Oscars? Was it his knighthood?
Definitely wasn't the Oscars. And I even remember that when people came around the house, the secretary got so upset, well, not upset, just irritated by people saying, oh, look, there are the Oscars, because that bored him really. And Vivian Leigh used to use doorstops in her house. And the knighthood, he used to say, well, it's practically posthumous, because it was quite late in coming. I don't think he was ever content or fulfilled. I think that he was always striving for something new. And maybe that is what you have to do if you are a creative artist. He never sat on his laurels for a minute. And of course, equally, he didn't put anything aside. He didn't invest his My Fair Lady earnings into gilt-edged stocks or anything like that for his old age. He, as one of his neighbors said, he ran another runway through the garden, so everything was on show. There were more roses, more flowers, more lilies, more whatever, So and what you saw was there was nothing left. So he was actually always quite worried about money. He nowadays, I think if he had a good agent, he would have had the most extraordinary success. I mean, I think nowadays the present day photographers making huge amounts of money. And he did make a lot of money at different times, but he spent it all in hospitality and living and and all the things around him. But it wasn't easy.
Hugo, we have a picture of him being knighted. When was he knighted? What you said he quipped that it was almost posthumously. How old was he?
Well, that was 1972, and he was born in 1904, so I guess he was about 68. And the funny thing about this is that he wears this grey suit, which, if I'm right, was one that he had designed for Rex Harrison to wear in the Ascot scene. But Rex Harrison, as you know, comes in totally unsuitable clothes, for Ascot. But the interesting thing was that Cecil Beaton was kind of terribly nervous of the Queen, and he'd been in the front row and he'd heard the Queen saying to all the other people, I understand you were a chairman of Middlesex Hospital for 30 years, or we so enjoyed our visit to you in Gibraltar in 1958, or whatever it was. And when it came to Cecil Beaton, she just said, it is a great pleasure. And he thought, no, surely he's going to say something else. So breaking all the rules, he said, and that's why the picture on the right is there. He said, oh ma'am, never did I think that when I came to photograph you and Princess Margaret in the pink taffeta dresses all those years ago, that one day I'd find myself kneeling here before you. To which apparently the Queen said, it is a great pleasure, and off he went. But his sisters who were sitting there said it looked as though they were having a perfectly good conversation. I think he had this extraordinary nervous side, which is so interesting. And perhaps that's all part of the creative side as well. But of course, nowadays, people are all filmed getting their honors from whoever it is. This was really just typical Cecil Beaton that he should be the one in this picture because they were doing some documentary about the Queen. And it was very rare to actually have a photograph of somebody being knighted in those days.
Oh, right, okay. Well, you mentioned his sisters just briefly again, and I just wanted to return to them. Did they enjoy his success as well? Because I mean, they were long suffering, having to stick their heads in, you know, glass domes and hang upside down and goodness knows what else.
Yes, they often spoke quite entertainingly in documentaries about that, and I'm sure that was as fun to look back on as it must have been sometimes annoying to do at the time. To be absolutely honest, it was a bit sad really about the sisters because when they did marry, they kind of stopped. You know how some people do? They didn't sort of go on, and one of them had married a baronet and had a very, very severe mother-in-law who knew exactly who Miss Beaton was and wasn't going to allow her to forget it. And so instead of, she used to draw rather well as well. So instead of being sort of Sir Hugh's eccentric wife who did beautiful sketches for the local flower show and things like that, you know, she sort of started wearing conventional clothes and going to the Chelsea Flower Show on the right day and things like that, and reading the court circular, and sort of and I think loved it when Cecil Beaton was entertained by the Queen Mother, but was rather disapproving if Mick Jagger came to stay. So they weren't, it wasn't a very easy relationship. Probably wasn't very easy for them. I mean, they were trying to lead different lives, really. So it wasn't so good, really.
Okay, well, Hugo, I've just got a couple of questions for you before we wrap up. One of them, do you think we live in very different times, and you know, you mentioned things like he didn't necessarily know if he'd got the shot until the film had been developed, etc. Whereas today, you know, you're right, you know, cameras are far more easier to use. We can see instantly whether it's a good shot, etc. So there's all that sort of thing. So he was very talented as a photographer. He was very talented as a designer. He was an author. He kept a diary. You know, there was just so much to him. Is there anyone today that measures up to him? You know, do we have a present day Cecil Beaton, or was he a product of his time, etc.? What do you think?
Well, I don't think he was so much a product of his time as he made himself into a product of his time. You know, he created himself, and he you know, he brought people along with him. It's what's so interesting about him that he, you know, he set the goalposts for so many things, and became an arbiter of taste. I mean, how did this little boy from Hampstead, you know, son of a timber merchant, suddenly find himself this great arbiter of taste? So that I mean, as one person who worked for him said, you know, he had his stethoscope on the heart of society. If there was a change in the beat, he wanted to know why. And Mrs. Bloomingdale, friend of Nancy Reagan, she said, you know, well, Cecil made you feel good by entertaining him. You know, how do we get into that position where we are, as a guest, by bestowing our presence on our host, we are making their day. I mean, it's not everybody who gets away with that, and he jolly well did.
No.
So in that sense,
No.
I think there are probably a lot of people who are very talented in specific fields these days. Of course there are, but not quite so many who've done so many varied things. As you say, a diarist, a traveler, you know, he's written about fashion, he's been an arbiter of taste, he's written a not very good play, he's designed the most wonderful costumes and sets, and I mean, we haven't even had time to talk about the ballet work and the opera work and all those things, and then his time photography and his general, also his you know, he was a brilliant host. You know, he you know, created beautiful houses which people were dying to be invited to, and all that, and also, you know, by being a photographer, he was able to, for example, if Marilyn Monroe was going to be photographed by him, she would come to his hotel room. He'd chase her around the room for 45 minutes, taking shots. So you end up with three sheets of contacts, and out of that would come a few good photographs. Meanwhile, he talked to her, and after she left, he would sit down and write 3 or 4 pages about her, in summarizing her character, and so you got the sort of rather good pen portraits as well as the photographs.
Yeah.
So he was really brilliant, and he worked extremely hard, and I think he really worked too hard. I think that's basically why he ended up having the stroke. Just you can see it when you read his diaries. When you know what's going to happen, you see it coming because he has these blinding, and must have been terribly difficult for him.
Hugo, my other question is far more frivolous. I believe you have his coat.
Oh, his overcoat. Well,
how?
Well, when I was working in the house, Eileen Hose sometimes used to give me things. Luckily, she didn't like Garbo, so when she found a sort of cache of film stills of Garbo, she said, "Oh, do you want these things?" So yes, please. And one day she said, "Try on the coat." So I did try it on, and it sort of fitted more or less pretty well, actually. And it was made in 1964, and I've still got it. I used to wear it quite a lot, but I subsequently had it copied 3 times in black cashmere, in grey cashmere, and another black version of it. And so I think the original should probably go to the V&A one day. It doesn't look quite so good as it used to, but it was designed by him with the most amazing flares at the back. So it's incredibly smart. So I love that. Yes, that was really nice. And in fact, when the book was published the biography was published in New York, Tom Wolfe reviewed it, and he said, there are certain problems about a book which is written in the very sleeves of the subject, because I used to sometimes take the coat with me I took it to Diana Vreeland, and she sort of clutched it to say, this is like her old friend. But when I took it to Irene Selznick's apartment, I thought to myself, well, that coat would never have got to that apartment with him in it, because she wouldn't have wanted to see it. So yes, here's the biography, and there's also the book of the portraits and profiles, or profiles, as he would know how to pronounce it, which was the mixture of photographs and sketches. And then recently I just published also my own diaries about doing the research, which has been really rather fun. I hope more Wonderland than Malice, but I leave the reader to decide.
Oh, Hugo, that's wonderful. I think sadly it's probably time for us to stop, but I just want to say, well, A, thank you, B, how much I've enjoyed reading Cecil Beaton's biography. I've still got a way to go, but my goodness, it's interesting. And I've also kind of had a dip into your latest book, the Malice in Wonderland, as well, and what a good read. So I think for anyone that's listening, the way forward, if you're interested in Cecil Beaton, go and get Hugo's books, come to Blenheim and see the exhibition, and hopefully you won't be disappointed. But Hugo, as ever, thank you so very, very much.
Well, thank you, Antonio.
Goodbye.
I really enjoyed it.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.